The cold of the stone floor was a familiar ache, a dull thrum that had become the baseline of her existence. It seeped through the coarse linen of her tunic, a threadbare garment that did little to ward off the chill of the great hall, or the deeper chill of her shame. Alara knelt, her head bowed, her hair a curtain of tangled brown hiding her face from the hundreds of eyes she could feel upon her. They were like insects, crawling over her skin, their silent judgment a physical weight pressing her down into the stone. She was nothing, less than nothing. The title they had stripped from her had been hollow for years, a ghost of a name belonging to a family that had long since discarded her. But here, in the unforgiving light of the equinox ceremony, the stripping was made real. It was a public flaying, a peeling away of the last layer of her identity, leaving only the raw, worthless thing underneath. By the laws of this duchy, her father's voice boomed, sharp and cold as a winter axe. For the crime of dishonoring her bloodline and consorting with the blighted, she is cast out. Duke Valerius, her father. He stood on the dais above her, resplendent in furs and gold, his face a mask of stern justice. He did not look at her. He had not truly looked at her in a decade. He spoke to the assembled nobles, to the lesser lords and ladies who whispered behind their hands, their expressions a mixture of pity and morbid fascination. Alara's crime had been an act of kindness, a loaf of bread for a starving family in the outer villages, a people her father had declared blighted by a wasting sickness. An act her father had twisted into treason, a convenient excuse to finally be rid of the Omega daughter who was a constant, nagging reminder of his first wife's weak blood. Her name is struck from the records, her rank is dissolved. She will bear the mark of the nameless, and serve as a ward of the state, her fate to be determined by the council. Each word was a hammer blow, forging the chains that would bind her forever. A guard stepped forward, his face impassive. He grabbed her arm, his grip bruising. He pushed up the sleeve of her tunic, revealing the pale skin of her wrist. Another man approached, a heated iron in his hand. The sigil was a simple circle, broken on one side, the mark of the unperson, the nameless. She did not scream when the iron touched her skin. The searing pain was a distant thing, less real than the crushing humiliation. The scent of her own burning flesh filled the air. A part of her welcomed it. Pain was honest. Pain was real. It was a confirmation of what she already knew herself to be, a thing to be marked, used, and discarded. When they were done, she was shoved back to her knees. The brand on her wrist throbbed, a fiery mouth screaming her new reality to the world. She was no one. She belonged nowhere. She was a ghost, haunting the edges of a life she was no longer permitted to live. Her father's judgment was not finished. As she is now a ward of the state, her upkeep is a burden we must address. A place will be found for her, a place of service, where she might yet learn the value of obedience. He was selling her, not with the crassness of a slave auction, but with the polished cruelty of politics. He was offering her up as a servant to whichever of his allies wished to curry favor. A low murmur went through the crowd. This was an unprecedented level of disgrace for a noble-born, even an Omega. It was a clear signal of her father's ruthlessness. He would cut out a piece of his own heart, if he had one, to maintain his power. Ilara kept her eyes fixed on a crack in the stone floor. It was a tiny dark line, a flaw in the perfect polish of the Duke's hall. She focused on it, pouring all her remaining will into that single, insignificant imperfection. It was her, a flaw to be ground down under the heels of greater men. She thought she might finally break, that a sob would tear itself from her throat. But there was nothing left inside to make the sound, just a hollow emptiness, scoured clean by years of her father's cold disdain. She had been raised to believe in her own worthlessness, and today was merely the public coronation of that belief. Then, the world changed. The great oaken doors at the far end of the hall did not open. They exploded inward, slamming against the stone walls with a crack like thunder. A wave of impossible cold washed through the room, extinguishing half the torches in its path, sending plumes of smoke coiling towards the high, raftered ceiling. The murmur of the crowd died in an instant, replaced by a collective, sharp intake of breath. Silence descended. A heavy, absolute silence that was more terrifying than any sound. Framed in the doorway, silhouetted against the gray winter light, stood a figure. He was immense, broader than any man she had ever seen, wrapped in black furs that seemed to drink the very light from the air. The cold radiated from him, a palpable aura of ancient ice and sovereign power. The Alpha King, King Theron, the Wolf of the North. A man who was more myth than reality. He had not left his frozen citadel in the north for 50 years. His name was a story told to frighten children, a whisper of a ruthless, immortal king who ruled a kingdom of ice and shadows. He moved, not with the measured steps of a ruler, but with the fluid, predatory grace of a wolf. The crowd parted before him, nobles and guards stumbling back as if repelled by a physical force. He paid them no mind. His gaze was fixed, locked on the dais, on her father. His eyes. Ilara had heard the stories, but they did no justice to the reality. They were not blue. They were the color of a winter sky just before a blizzard, a pale, piercing shade of gray so light it was almost silver. They held no warmth, no emotion she could name. They were the eyes of a glacier, ancient, beautiful, and utterly merciless. Her father, Duke Valerius, who had seemed a giant just moments before, looked small. The color drained from his face, his mask of stern justice cracking to reveal a flicker of raw, primal fear. He bowed, a stiff, jerky movement. "Your Majesty," he stammered, an unexpected honor. The king did not stop. He did not speak. He walked past the dais, past her father, as if he were nothing more than a stone statue. His heavy boots made no sound on the floor. He moved through the absolute silence he had created, his presence a crushing weight that stole the air from Ilara's lungs. He was coming towards her. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the numbness. This could not be happening. Why was he here? Why was he looking at her? This had to be a new, unimagined form of punishment. A nightmare conjured from her despair. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could feel the unnatural cold emanating from his body. It was a deep, penetrating cold, like the heart of a winter mountain. She had to crane her neck to look up at him, and still she could not see his face clearly, only the hard line of his jaw and the shadow of his immense form. He knelt. The King of the North, the Alpha of Alphas, knelt on one knee in front of her, the nameless Omega. The sound that rippled through the hall was not a gasp. It was a wave of pure, unadulterated shock, a sound of reality itself breaking. Slowly, as if he had all the time in the world, he reached out. His hand was bare, his fingers long and scarred. He did not touch her face or her shoulder. He gently took her wrist, the one with the fresh, weeping brand. His skin was not just cool, it was cold as the stone she knelt on. His thumb brushed over the raw, burned flesh of the mark. She flinched, a tremor of pain and terror shaking her entire body. But his touch was impossibly gentle. The gesture was so quiet, so intimate. It felt more shocking than his explosive entrance. He looked at the broken circle branded into her skin. For the first time, an emotion flickered in those glacial eyes. It wasn't pity, it was something harder, colder. A deep, still anger that was more frightening than any shout. He looked up, not at her, but over her head, his gaze finding her father on the dais. His voice, when it came, was not a king's pronouncement. It was a low, quiet rumble, like stones grinding together deep within the earth. It was a sound meant only for the Duke, yet it carried through the petrified silence of the hall. "You would mark what is mine." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a judgment. Then he looked down at her. His gaze met hers, and the world fell away. The crowd, the hall, her father. They all ceased to exist. There was only the endless silver winter of his eyes. She saw a loneliness in them so profound it was like looking into a starless night sky. "I'll take this one," he said, his voice softer now, meant only for her. He stood, pulling her to her feet with him. Her legs were weak, trembling. She stumbled, and his arm went around her waist to steady her, his grip firm and absolute. The cold of his body was a shock, seeping through her thin tunic, but it was a solid, real thing in a world that had just dissolved into madness. He turned, drawing her with him, and began to walk back the way he had come. The sea of nobles parted again, their faces a gallery of disbelief and terror. He did not look at them. He did not look at her father, who stood frozen on the dais, his face a mask of apoplectic rage and confusion. As they reached the shattered doors, he paused. Without turning, he spoke one final time, his voice once again carrying the weight of absolute command. "Her name is Alara, and she is now under my protection. Any who object can take their concerns to my dungeons." He swept her out of the hall, out into the cold, gray light of a world she no longer recognized. Her name. He had said her name. A name she thought had been erased forever. In the heart of her public destruction, the Alpha King had arrived and claimed the ashes. She didn't know if she had been rescued or condemned to a colder, more terrible fate. The journey north was a blur of gray skies, black pines, and unrelenting cold. King Theron did not speak to her again. He had placed her in a covered carriage, insulated with thick furs, while he rode ahead on a massive black war horse that seemed as much a creature of winter as he was. His guards, a silent, disciplined cohort of warriors clad in dark steel and wolf pelts, formed a perimeter around her that was both a protection and a cage. She spent the days huddled in the furs, the throbbing of the brand on her wrist a constant reminder of the life that had been torn away. Her mind was a maelstrom of confusion. Why? Why her? A nameless Omega, a branded disgrace. What could the most powerful man in the world possibly want with her? Her fear whispered that it was a game, a power play against her father. She was a pawn, a piece to be moved on a board she couldn't comprehend, and she would be discarded just as easily when her usefulness was at an end. This thought was a cold comfort, a familiar narrative of her own lack of worth. It made more sense than any other explanation. After a week of travel, the landscape changed. The rolling hills gave way to jagged peaks, their tops wreathed in perpetual snow. The air grew thinner, colder, tasting of iron and ice. They were entering his kingdom. The citadel, when it came into view, was not so much built as it was carved from the heart of a mountain. It was a fortress of black stone and ice, its towers like shards of obsidian clawing at the sky. It was a place of brutal, austere beauty, a monument to power and isolation. It was a reflection of the king himself. Inside, the citadel was a labyrinth of echoing stone halls, vast and silent. The air was frigid, the cold seeming to emanate from the very walls. There were no roaring fires in the hearths, only low-burning embers that gave off a sullen, heatless light. Servants moved like ghosts in the shadows, their faces pale and expressions guarded. They looked at her with a mixture of fear and curiosity, but no one dared to speak to her. She was taken to a suite of rooms high in one of the towers. They were larger than any space she had ever occupied, with a canopied bed, a heavy oak table, and a balcony that overlooked a sheer drop into a valley of snow-dusted pines. A fire had been laid in the hearth, but it too burned low, a flicker of orange against the oppressive chill. He came to her that evening. He entered without knocking, a looming shadow in the dim light. He had shed his heavy traveling furs and wore a simple black tunic that did nothing to diminish his imposing presence. "You will be comfortable here," he said. It was a statement, not a question. His silver eyes swept the room, then landed on her. She stood by the cold hearth, twisting her hands together, feeling small and utterly out of place. "Why?" The word was a whisper, a breath of sound she hadn't intended to release. He stilled, his gaze sharpening. "Why what?" "Why me?" she managed, her voice trembling. "I am nothing. A disgrace." He walked towards her, and she had to fight the instinct to shrink back. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could feel the unnatural aura of cold that clung to him. "My reasons are my own," he said, his voice flat. "This is a political arrangement. Your father overstepped. I am reminding him of his place. You are a symbol of my authority over him." A pawn. She had been right. The confirmation should have been a relief, a solid piece of ground in the shifting landscape of her life. Instead, a strange, sharp disappointment pierced her. It was an absurd feeling. What had she expected? "You will be my ward," he continued, his tone clinical. "You will want for nothing. Food, clothing, books. You are not a prisoner, but you will not leave the citadel. Do you understand?" She nodded numbly. "Yes, Your Majesty." He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. His eyes dropped to her wrist, which she had instinctively hidden in the folds of her sleeve. "Let me see it." Hesitantly, she held out her arm. The brand was no longer an angry red, but a dark, ugly scar against her pale skin. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers cold against hers. His touch was feather light as he traced the outline of the broken circle. A shiver ran through her, not from the cold, but from the contact itself. No one had touched her with such care in her entire life. He said nothing. He simply held her wrist for a moment longer, his gaze distant, as if looking at something far beyond the walls of the room. Then he released her and turned to leave. "There is a boundary, Alara," he said, his back to her. "I am your guardian. I am your king. I am not your friend. Do not forget that." The door closed behind him, leaving her alone in the vast, cold silence. The boundary was set. It was a wall of ice, as tall and impenetrable as the mountains outside her window. And yet, she couldn't stop feeling the ghost of his cold fingers on her skin, a touch that had felt less like a king claiming his property and more like something else entirely, something she was terrified to name. The days that followed settled into a strange, quiet rhythm. Ilara kept to her rooms, or explored the cavernous, silent library, a place so vast it seemed to hold all the forgotten stories of the world. She saw the king only rarely, a glimpse of his black-clad form striding down a distant corridor, a brief, formal nod at the sparsely attended evening meal in the great hall. He held true to his word. He was her guardian, a cold, remote presence in her life. But the boundary, as solid as it seemed, began to show cracks. One evening she fell asleep in the library, curled in a great leather chair with a book of ancient maps open on her lap. She was woken by the sensation of something soft and heavy being draped over her. She opened her eyes to find the king's great fur-lined cloak covering her. The room was empty. He had come and gone like a ghost, but the cloak remained, smelling faintly of pine and winter and a scent that was uniquely his. It was warmer than any fire. Another time she was sketching in a small notebook she had found, trying to capture the stark beauty of the snow-covered peaks outside her window. She was so lost in her work she didn't hear him enter. "What are you drawing?" His deep voice, so close behind her, made her jump. She whirled around, clutching the book to her chest. "Nothing, Your Majesty. Just scribbles." His eyes held a flicker of something, Not amusement, but a quiet curiosity. "Let me see." It was a command, softly spoken but undeniable. Trembling, she handed him the book. He took it, his large, scarred hand surprisingly careful with the small object. He flipped through the pages, his expression unreadable. She had filled them with drawings of the mountains, the ancient pines, a lone wolf she had seen on a distant ridge. He stopped at a portrait she had done from memory. It was of him, standing on the battlements, looking out at his frozen kingdom. She had captured the loneliness in his posture, the weight of centuries in his gaze. She felt her face burn with shame. It was too intimate, too presumptuous. He stared at the drawing for a long time. She expected anger, a cold reprimand for her insolence. Instead, he simply closed the book and handed it back to her. "You see too much," he said, his voice quiet. And then he was gone. The most telling moment came during a storm. A blizzard descended on the citadel, a howling monster of wind and snow that shook the very foundations of the mountain. Ilara stood on her balcony, watching the storm, feeling a strange kinship with its wild, untamable fury. A sudden, violent tremor shook the tower, not from the storm, but from deep within the stone. She cried out as she was thrown against the railing. Before she could fall, a powerful arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her back from the edge. It was Theron. His face was pale, drawn. A sheen of sweat beaded on his brow, despite the bitter cold. He was breathing heavily, his hand pressed against his own chest. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice strained. "No, What was that?" she asked, her heart pounding. "Nothing. An old settlement in the mountain's heart," he said, his words clipped. But she knew he was lying. She could feel a fine tremor running through his body, a deep, internal shudder that had nothing to do with the citadel's groanings. And the cold coming off him was more intense than ever before. It was a dead, lifeless cold, like the depths of a frozen lake. You're trembling," she whispered, her fear for herself forgotten, replaced by a sudden, sharp concern for him. His silver eyes snapped to hers, and for a second, the mask of control slipped. She saw a flash of raw agony, a glimpse of a man fighting a terrible private war. It was there and gone in an instant. "I am fine," he bit out, releasing her and stepping back. The wall of ice was back in place, higher and colder than ever. "Stay away from the balconies during these tremors." He turned and left, his stride stiff, his back ramrod straight. But she had seen it. She had seen the crack in the glacier. The king of the north, the immortal wolf, was hiding a wound. A deep, festering wound that seemed to be consuming him from the inside out. The boundary he had drawn between them was not just to keep her out, it was to keep his own brokenness in. And in that moment she realized her quiet, lonely life in his cold, silent castle had become something far more complicated and far more dangerous than a simple political arrangement. She was beginning to care for the man behind the crown, a man who was determined to suffer alone. The fragile peace of their arrangement was shattered by the arrival of a raven. It was a sleek black bird with eyes like chips of obsidian, bearing the silver seal of the southern duchies. It was a message for the king, but its presence felt like an omen for her. The past was not as distant as she had hoped. A week later, her father arrived. Duke Valerius came not as a penitent, but as an envoy, draped in the diplomatic immunity of a council summons. He walked into Theron's throne room with a practiced air of humility that did not reach his eyes. He saw her standing in the shadows behind the throne, and his lips thinned in a look of pure venom before he smoothed his expression into one of paternal concern. "Ilara, my child," he said, his voice oozing false warmth. "To see you safe and well under His Majesty's care, it is a great relief." Theron, seated on the throne of black stone, was impassive. The great hall was cold, but the king's presence made it glacial. "State your purpose, Valerius." "I come on behalf of the Southern Council, your majesty," the duke said, bowing. "There is unrest. Whispers of your seclusion. They wish for reassurance, a show of unity, a grand feast, to celebrate the continued strength of your reign." It was a trap. Ilara could feel it in her bones. A gilded, polite trap. Her father was using the council to force his way back into the king's presence, to probe for weakness. Theron's silver eyes narrowed. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint crackle of the low-burning torches. "Very well," he said at last. "A feast will be held, a show of unity." Her father's smile was triumphant. In the days leading up to the feast, the Duke sought her out. He found her in the library, his presence a polluting slick in her quiet sanctuary. "He is a monster, you know," her father whispered, his voice a conspiratorial hiss. "A cold, dying thing. Look at him. Does he seem like a man who will live to see another decade? His line is cursed. The cold will consume him, just as it did his father." Ilara turned away, her heart pounding. "Leave me alone." "I am your father. I am trying to save you," he insisted, grabbing her arm. His grip was tight, cruel. "He has no heir. When he falls, this kingdom will tear itself apart. You will be torn apart with it. Help me. Tell me his weaknesses. I can secure a place for you. Restore your name." "My name?" she spat, wrenching her arm from his grasp. "You burned my name from my skin. You have no right to speak it." His face contorted with rage. "You ungrateful whelp. You choose a monster over your own blood? So be it. But when he is gone, do not come crawling back to me." He stormed out, leaving her trembling, the ghost of his hateful grip on her arm. He had confirmed her deepest fear. Theron was dying. The cold, the tremors, the agony she'd seen in his eyes. It was an illness, a curse, and her father knew all about it. He wasn't just probing for weakness, he was planning to exploit it. The night of the feast arrived. The great hall, usually so stark and empty, was filled with southern lords who had accompanied her father. They were a flock of peacocks, all bright silks and loud laughter, a stark contrast to the grim, silent northerners. The air was thick with tension, a veneer of civility stretched thin over a well of animosity. Ilara sat at Theron's right hand, a position of honor that made her a target for both the curious stares of the southerners and the resentful glares of the northern court. She wore a simple gown of dark blue velvet, a gift from the king that had appeared in her chambers without a word. It was a beautiful garment, but it felt like armor she didn't know how to wear. Theron was a figure of ice and shadow at the head of the table. He was more withdrawn than ever, his face a mask of cold authority, but she could see the signs, the faint tremor in his hand as he lifted his goblet, the unnatural pallor of his skin beneath his tan. He was fighting it, holding the decay at bay through sheer force of will. Her father rose to propose a toast. He held his goblet high, his voice ringing with false sincerity. "To King Theron, for his continued health and the enduring strength of his kingdom. May his reign be long and prosperous." The lords cheered and raised their glasses. Theron inclined his head in a regal acknowledgement. As he brought his own silver goblet to his lips, Ilara saw it. A faint, oily shimmer on the surface of the dark wine. A distortion in the torchlight that lasted only a second. Poison. Her blood ran cold. It was a subtle, slow-acting poison, no doubt. Something designed to mimic and accelerate the symptoms of his illness, to make his inevitable collapse seem like the natural progression of his curse. Her father would be miles away before the king fell, his hands clean, his plot complete. He would use the chaos of a kingless north to make his move. And she, the disgraced daughter who was last seen at the king's side, would be the perfect scapegoat. Her mind screamed. She had to do something. But what? To cry out would be her word against a powerful duke's. They would call her mad, hysterical, a liar seeking revenge. Theron's silver eyes met hers across the table. He saw the panic on her face. A silent question flickered in his gaze. He was going to drink. She had only a heartbeat to act. In a single, fluid motion, she lunged across the space between them, her hand shooting out and knocking the silver goblet from his grasp. It hit the stone floor with a loud clang, splashing dark red wine across the stones like blood. A shocked silence fell over the hall. Every eye was on her. Her father's face was a mask of thunderous fury. "Ilara, what is the meaning of this insolence?" Theron did not look angry. He simply looked at her, his gaze intense, searching. "The wine," she gasped, her voice shaking. It's spoiled." It was the only excuse she could think of, a feeble, desperate lie. Her father laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "Spoiled? In the king's own cup? The girl is mad. The shame has clearly broken her mind." But Theron was not looking at her father. He was looking at the wine spilled on the floor. Where it had puddled, the stone was beginning to hiss faintly, a wisp of acrid smoke rising from its surface. It was a poison so potent it was etching the very stone. His gaze slowly lifted, moving from the floor to her, and finally to her father. The temperature in the hall dropped by 20 degrees. The anger that filled his eyes was not hot and loud. It was a cold, silent, killing fury, the fury of a glacier about to calve. He knew. He didn't need proof. He didn't need her accusations. He saw the truth in her desperate act, in the poison on the floor, and in the panicked guilt on the Duke's face. But the poison in the cup was not the only threat. The king had already been drinking from a pitcher all evening. How much had he already consumed? The thought hit her with the force of a physical blow. This was not a failed attempt. It was already in motion. The poison did not fell him at the feast. The king was a master of control. He ended the night with chilling finality, dismissing the southern lords and placing Duke Valerius under house arrest pending an investigation. But Ilara saw the cost. As he stood from the throne, he swayed, catching himself on the stone arm. A fine tremor racked his body. He was holding himself together by sheer, impossible will. She followed him as he swept from the hall, his guards trailing behind. He did not dismiss her. He seemed to have forgotten she was there, his focus turned entirely inward, on the battle raging within his own body. He made it to the door of his private chambers before he stumbled. One of his guards lunged to support him, but the king waved him off with a snarl. "Leave me!" His men hesitated, their faces etched with concern, but the command was absolute. They retreated, leaving Ilara alone in the corridor with him. He leaned against the heavy wooden door, his head bowed, his breathing ragged. "You should go," he rasped, not looking at her. "No," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. He looked up then, and the sight of his face stole her breath. The mask was gone. All of it. In its place was a landscape of pure agony. His skin was ashen, his lips tinged with blue. The cold pouring off him was no longer a subtle aura. It was a physical force, making the air around him shimmer. Frost was beginning to crystallize in his dark hair and on the collar of his tunic. "I told you to go," he growled, but the words had no heat. They were the rumble of a collapsing mountain. He pushed himself away from the door and staggered into his chambers. She followed, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The room was Spartan, dominated by a massive hearth and a bed draped in black wolf pelts. He didn't make it to the bed. He collapsed onto the floor, a low groan of pain torn from his throat. Ilara rushed to his side. She knelt beside him, reaching out to touch his arm. His skin was like ice. A wave of a dreadful, deathly cold washed over her, so intense it made her teeth ache. She could see it now, creeping across his skin like a living thing, a delicate, deadly lacework of frost spreading from his chest. The curse. The poison hadn't created this, it had unleashed it. It had shattered whatever control he had over the decay that was consuming him. "The physicians!" she cried, scrambling to her feet. "I'll get the physicians!" "No." His voice was a bare whisper. "They can do nothing. It has me." His silver eyes found hers. The cold fury was gone, replaced by a terrible, weary resignation. He had been fighting this for so long, he was tired. A commotion sounded in the hall outside. The heavy door burst open and her father strode in, flanked by two of his own guards. The king's guard must have been dealt with. "So, the wolf is finally brought to heel." Duke Valerius sneered, his eyes glittering with triumph. He looked at the king, dying on the floor, and then at her. "And the Omega pup weeps over him. How touching." "You did this," she breathed, raw hatred choking her. "I merely hastened the inevitable," her father said with a shrug, "and provided myself with the perfect story, the disgraced daughter, taking her revenge on the king who used her as a political pawn. Tragic, really." He gestured to his guards. "Seize her. Lock her in the dungeons. We will have her confession by morning." The guards started towards her. But Alara didn't move. She planted herself between them and the king's body, her arms spread wide. "No," she said, the word a raw tear in the silence. "You will not touch him." Her father laughed. "Brave words. From a nameless, powerless little thing. What will you do? Weep at me?" She looked down at Theron. His breathing was so shallow now it was almost non-existent. The frost was creeping up his neck, towards his face. He was leaving her. The one person in the entire world who had looked at her and seen something worth saving was being stolen from her. The one person who had given her back her name. "You saw me," she whispered, her voice breaking, the words meant only for him. "You saw me when no one else would. Don't you dare leave me in the dark again." A dam of grief and despair broke inside her. It was not a gentle sorrow. It was a flood. A tidal wave of rage and love and absolute desperate refusal. She would not let him die. She would not let this vicious, hollow man win. She would not go back to being nothing. She dropped to her knees beside Theron again, ignoring her father, ignoring the guards. She placed her hands on the king's chest, directly over his heart, where the frost was thickest. The cold was excruciating, a pain that felt like it was freezing her own blood, burning her down to the bone. But she didn't pull away. She pushed through it. She closed her eyes, pouring every ounce of her will, every memory of his small kindnesses, every bit of the terrifying, fragile hope he had sparked in her, into her hands. She had nothing else to give. No power, no rank, no name but the one he had given her. So she gave him her life. She offered it up, a silent, desperate prayer. Take it. Take all of it. Just live. Something shifted. Deep within her, in the hollow place where her worthlessness had lived, a spark ignited. A tiny ember of warmth. Fed by her sacrifice, by her love, by her sheer, defiant rage, it flared. The warmth bloomed, rushing down her arms and into her hands. A soft, golden light began to glow from her palms, pushing against the deathly cold of the king's body. The frost on his chest hissed, sizzling like water on a hot stone, and began to retreat. The light intensified, growing brighter and brighter until it was a blinding torrent of pure, liquid life. It erupted from her. The light filled the room, a wave of impossible warmth and vitality. It threw her father and his guards back against the far wall as if they had been struck by lightning. It was not a gentle light. It was a raw, untamed power, the power of creation itself, unleashed and furious. She felt it surging through her, healing her, remaking her. The brand on her wrist burned, not with the pain of its making, but with a clean, white heat. When the light subsided, the ugly scar of the broken circle was gone, replaced by smooth, unblemished skin. She felt the power flowing into Theron, a river of life pouring into a barren desert. It drove back the frost, melted the ice in his veins, and coaxed the slow, tired beat of his heart into a stronger, steadier rhythm. She felt the curse, the ancient cold thing that had lived in his bloodline for centuries, recoil from her light, shrieking in a silent agony before it was burned away into nothing. When the light finally faded, Ilara collapsed forward, her strength utterly spent. She lay against his chest, her ear pressed to his heart, listening. Thump, 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 strong, steady, alive. A choked sob of relief escaped her. A hand, no longer cold as ice but warm with life, came up to gently cup the back of her head. Ilara, a voice whispered. His voice. Not the strained rasp of a dying man, but a deep, clear resonance full of a wonder that mirrored her own. She pushed herself up, her limbs trembling with exhaustion. She looked down at him. The frost was gone. The deathly pallor was gone. Color had returned to his face. He was breathing deeply, easily. And his eyes were open, fixed on her. They were no longer the pale, glacial silver of a winter sky. They were the color of warm slate after a summer rain, a deep, clear gray, and they were filled with a raw, unguarded emotion that made her heart ache. "You," he whispered, his voice thick with awe. He reached up, his fingers gently tracing the side of her face. "It was you. The warmth. I felt it. The legends were true." Before she could ask what he meant, the door crashed open again. This time it was the king's personal guard, the Huskarls, their swords drawn, their faces grim. They had overcome the duke's men and now stormed the room, ready for battle. They stopped dead, their eyes wide, taking in the scene. Their king, alive and sitting up. The duke and his men, groaning on the floor against the far wall. And her, kneeling beside their king, her hands still resting on his chest. Her father staggered to his feet, his face a mess of terror and disbelief. "She's a witch!" he shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at her. "She enchanted him! She tried to kill him! Seize the witch!" But no one was listening to him. They were all looking at their king. Theron rose to his feet. He was unsteady for a moment, and Ilara instinctively moved to help him, but he steadied himself, drawing strength from some deep, newly refilled well. He was no longer the cold, dying king. He stood tall, the full, terrifying power of the Alpha King radiating from him, but this time it was not a cold power. It was a living, breathing force, vital and absolute. "There is a traitor in this room," Theron said, his voice quiet, yet it boomed in the sudden silence. "But it is not her." He turned his gaze, now hard as flint, on Duke Valerius. "You tried to poison me. You used my illness, the curse of my bloodline, to stage a coup. You would have framed an innocent woman, your own daughter, for your crimes." He took a step forward. "For centuries, my family has been afflicted by a creeping ice, a decay of the soul passed from father to son. The legends spoke of a counterbalance. A sun-blessed mate, whose warmth could break the curse forever. I thought it was a fairy tale, a dying man's hope." He turned his gaze back to Ilara, and his expression softened into one of profound reverence. "I was wrong. I felt the mark of it on you the moment I saw you. A tiny, buried ember. I brought you here to protect that ember, not understanding what it truly was. I set boundaries to protect you from the cold I carried inside me. I was a fool." He looked at her. "Me. his heart in his eyes. She did not try to kill me. She just saved my life. She saved my bloodline. She saved this kingdom from the cold that has held it for 500 years. He walked past the stunned guards, past her trembling father. He walked to her. And in front of the entire world, the living, breathing Alpha King went down on one knee. He took her hand, the one that no longer bore a mark of shame, and raised it to his lips. "They stripped you of your name and rank," he said, his voice breaking with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "I am giving you mine. Ilara, be my queen." Tears streamed down her face, but they were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of release. The hollow, worthless part of her was gone, burned away and replaced by a light she was only just beginning to understand. She looked at the king kneeling before her, the man she had saved, the man who had saved her. She looked at his hand holding hers, warm and strong. She looked into his eyes and saw her future, a future she had never dared to dream of. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes." 6 months passed. Spring came to the north with a vibrancy no one had seen in living memory. The snows melted from the high peaks weeks earlier than usual, and wildflowers, bold and bright, carpeted the valleys. The land itself seemed to be rejoicing, breathing a sigh of relief after a winter that had lasted for centuries. The oppressive cold of the citadel was gone, replaced by a comfortable warmth. Fires now roared in the hearths, not out of necessity, but for cheer. Laughter echoed in the halls that had once known only silence. Ilara, their sun-blessed queen, was the reason. Her presence, her very life, had broken the curse. She learned to control the power within her, not as a weapon, but as a balm. She could coax life from barren soil, mend broken bones with a touch, and soothe the troubled minds of those who had lived for too long under a shadow of cold and despair. The people loved her with a fierce, protective devotion. She was not just their queen, she was their miracle. Her father, the former Duke Valerius, was a distant memory. Stripped of his name, his lands, his titles, he languished in the deepest, darkest cell of the Citadel's dungeons. Theron had wanted to execute him, but Ilara had asked for a different justice. "Let him live," she had said. "Let him live a long life as a nameless, powerless man. Let him understand what he tried to do to me." And so he sat in the dark, forgotten by the world, a ghost haunted by his own ambition. She was Queen Ilara now, and the name felt as natural as breathing. The self-doubt, the ingrained belief in her own worthlessness, was a faint scar on her soul, a reminder of the journey she had taken, but it no longer had power over her. She was loved, not just by the people, but by her king. Theron was a changed man. The icy, remote monarch was gone, replaced by a king who was strong and decisive, but also capable of warmth and laughter. The loneliness had been chased from his eyes, replaced by a deep, abiding love for her that was plain for all to see. He was her partner in everything, valuing her counsel in matters of state as much as he cherished her presence in the quiet hours of the night. One bright, warm afternoon, he found her in the gardens. It was her favorite place, a series of terraces she had brought back to life, now overflowing with roses and herbs and fragrant blossoms. She was tending to a climbing rose, her hands buried in the rich soil, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. He came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her back against his chest. He nuzzled her neck, his breath warm against her skin. "My queen smells of dirt," he murmured, his voice rumbling with affection. She laughed, leaning back into his embrace. "And my king smells of council meetings and old parchment. I think I have the better of it." He chuckled, a rich, easy sound that still made her heart leap. He turned her in his arms to face him, his expression growing serious, though his eyes still shone with love. He gently took her left hand, turning it over in his. His thumb brushed across her wrist, over the spot where the brand had once been. There was no trace of it now, not even the faintest discoloration. "I think of it often," he said quietly. "The day I walked into that hall, the sight of that iron touching your skin." A shadow of the memory passed over her, but it held no pain. "It was the day my life ended." "No," he said, his gaze intense, holding hers. He lifted her hand and pressed a soft kiss to her wrist. "It was the day I found my life." He brought her hand to his chest, placing it over his heart. "The day you began to save me, even before either of us knew it." She covered his hand with her free one, her heart swelling with a love so vast it felt as bright and powerful as the sun itself. The shy, broken girl who had knelt on the cold stone floor was gone forever. In her place was a woman, a healer, a queen. "You're wrong," she said softly, a gentle smile playing on her lips. She looked around at the vibrant, living garden, at the warm sun on her face, at the man she loved more than life itself. "It's not a reminder of the day you found your life." She met his loving, questioning gaze, her own eyes shining. "It's a reminder of the day I found mine."